Thanks for listening to the Archbridge podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wilterdink, and today I'll be talking with Priya Sarathy Jones. Priya is the National Policy and Campaigns Director at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, where she's primarily responsible for supporting and leading national coalitions for fines and fees reform. Prior to joining the center, Priya worked at the Department of Justice for nearly a decade, served in a variety of policy positions. Her portfolio included public defense with an emphasis on Sixth Amendment issues, as well as wrongful conviction, capital case litigation, and tribal law enforcement. In addition to her policy work at the Justice Department, Priya also served as Senior Counsel for the House Oversight Committee. So Priya, it's really great to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to kind of get things off started for people who are really not involved in this space at all, or maybe not know why there's an issue with fines and fees at all. So, in my mind, a fine or a fee, something you pay for like a business license or something, or a fine, you get a traffic ticket, something like that. That's sort of what I think of, maybe what most people think of. So can you kind of give me sort of an overview of, that's probably not the whole picture when it comes to fines and fees. So what are some of the things that we're missing? So why are fines and fees something that are worthy of our attention, and how have they become a problem?
Sure. So, you sort of touched on it. So by definition, a fine and a fee have different legal definitions. So a fee and purposes. So a fine is the punishment, is the punitive aspect of when there's a violation or an offense. You think of like a fine, and oftentimes it's thought to be in lieu as an alternative to any type of incarceration. So when you're thinking about traffic, that is definitely a place where fines show up. A fee is solely about revenue generation and sort of costs for the government. And so that could be to generate new revenue. It could be to cover costs. It could be entirely unrelated to any of these things, or it's just money that's going to go to various aspects of government operations, programming, things that have nothing to do with wherever sort of the fee originates. And so, you have, and also on the government side, I think you probably need to think of fees in two contexts. You touched on it, like, you might have an application fee for a business license or something that the government is operating in. But when we're talking about fines and fees, we are exclusively talking about when they show up in the criminal legal system. And so, or something sort of traffic is adjacent because it's a little quasi-criminal. In some places it is criminal, some places it's civil, but it has sort of criminal implications. And so for us, when we're talking about fees, we're talking about people who have contact with these systems who are then charged numerous fees once that contact occurs. And that could be, once again, for some of the line items could be directly related to the contact, but a lot of them are not. They go to trauma centers and they go to, police retirement funds and trainings and sort of anything that you think that the government might be needing to pay for. They have become a mechanism how we pay for various government operations. So we really just see them as taxes. It's a different form of taxation, but it is only happening for people who are having contact with the system, which we know is disproportionately low-income individuals and Black and Brown communities. And so when you start getting into like, well, who's having that contact? So then who's being asked to pay for that? You sort of get into the racial disparities of how we already sort of very aware that the criminal legal system works in general. So that's really.
Can you give me an example of like a kind of this sort of contact that you're talking about, or sort of a typical situation that you might think of?
Let's take a traffic encounter. I mean, I think that's probably the most simple in the sense that most people understand it. Most people have probably had it to some extent
right.
in various places. And so, I think a lot of people would actually be surprised to know that in at least 12 states still, that low-level traffic violations, the kind that people make sort of every day when they're driving, thinking about not fully, completely stopping at a stop sign or changing lanes, right, without signaling, this kind of thing.
California rolling stop.
Yeah. California rolling stop, they're criminal in 12 states. And so that means that they're misdemeanors. And so that means that warrants can attach. That means a lot of things can start to happen, right? There are a lot of consequences when you don't pay the ticket. And so a really specific sort of example of this will be like in California, you get a ticket, and the ticket, let's say, is $150, which, by the way, is pretty high to begin with for really low level traffic infractions, especially when we're thinking about where most people in this country really fall in terms of their economic stability, how much money they have in savings for like a case like this if something happens. And so if you get stopped and you get this $150 ticket, if you don't pay it in full, usually in the time period that's allotted, some places that's 30 days, some places it's 45, some places it's 60. What happens is it doubles, right? It doubles in most places. And so that doubling is a fee. It's another name for a fee. It's a penalty, right? And then in California specifically, there's a $300 surcharge that is attached to that ticket. And so you easily go...
If it's not paid on time.
It's not paid in those 30 days. And so then something that was $150, all of a sudden is $450, right? And so, and that's just one of the fees. That's just the surcharge. It's the highest one. So it's like an example that I would use, but there's also other fees that could be, smaller, $2 fee here, a $3 fee here, a $10 fee here, right? That add up also. So then at the end, you have this cumulative fee structure on top of the fine that has been assessed for your traffic violation. And so that is the most common, I would say, way that this sort of appears, is that the everyday traffic citation, but you can also think of it in everyday misdemeanors, right, that are showing up across the country where they do not have jail time. Well, they might have jail time, but we're not obviously encouraging that they do have jail time. And then people are getting those citations, they come with fines, and then they have court costs and fees and all kinds of things that come up. So you also see, if you try to show up and like dispute your ticket, you might say, fine, we'll dismiss the ticket. Don't worry about that. And we'll charge you the $250 for court fees for coming here today. And so
Great.
That's another way that they show up. And so there's not situations where you say like, I didn't do it, I shouldn't be here, this is what's going on. And then it's like $0, go on with your day. You're charged for showing.
So that's very rare.
Yeah. I mean, it's very rare that you will not have some financial situation that attaches, whether you pay it in full up front, whether you pay it, you're late, you're behind, whether you get on a payment plan and you're charged extra fees because you're on the payment plan. So here's an extra $15 a month every time you need to make a payment, right? So the numerous ways that this shows up really vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but you can also think about who's most likely to bear the cost of those fees, right? Who's not paying their ticket right away and on time when they get it? Usually someone that doesn't have the means to just deal with it, right? To just say that it's okay, it's $200 and I'm annoyed and maybe I shouldn't have gotten the ticket in the first place, but it's not worth my time today to dispute that. So I'm going to pay my $200 and I'm going to go about my day. But if that's not an option for you, and even if you have to get on a payment plan and then they say, it's $50 up front, and then it's an extra $15 fee every time you make a payment. You see how all of these things start to add up, and
right.
And for the government in particular, it's an easy thing to do, right? Where you think about how, and I'm by no means a tax expert, but I do know it's incredibly difficult to change your tax laws, right? To get taxes passed, to increase them, to sort of go through the process that many places have for those types of decisions to be made. But it's really easy to say, we're going to attach an extra $100 surcharge here, an extra fee here. And we've seen that happen a lot over the last 15 years. And really, there's fees and fines have always been a part of the U.S. Criminal legal system. And, there's an excessive fines clause, right, in the Constitution. But then there's the fees really started to ramp up where we saw during the Great Recession, when there were budget strains in state and local governments, you start to see the fees go up and where they show up, how much they are, even fines and number and amount start to increase across the country, and new things start to be added to the books for fines. And so what it's really become is a tool for trying to address your budget shortfalls across the country. And so we saw it in the Great Recession.
Right.
And we're watching and heavily concerned about how it's showing up now too, given what's been going on the last 2 years.
Right. So you have that initial budget crunch, and then rather than taking the case to your constituents and making the case for why we need more revenue, or, on the other side of things, trying to trim that budget and try to rein in costs, you're trying to squeeze, rather than doing either of those two more responsible things, you're trying to squeeze out this extra revenue from a place that is not meant to raise revenue, right? Like that's not why we have those things. That's not what it's intended for.
No.
So is there, I guess if I were, well, okay, let me back up here. How widespread is this problem? Is this something that people are dealing with in every state in the United States? Or you mentioned, some states, the traffic violations are criminal, 12, I think you said, and that probably leads into some more serious consequences when it comes to fines and fees. But how, is this like half the country, or how widespread is this
Every
issue?
Every single state
Okay.
does this in some capacity or the other. So fines and fees exist in every single state. Fees in particular, fines exist in every state. Fees also exist in every state. The variation is all the ways that they show up, right? And so whether you're gonna see them, and where you're going to see them and where they go, right? So that's probably the variety, right? The thing that's harder to pin down is what are all the fees in every single state? I could not tell you that. It's extremely hard to track down. And where do those fees go? Something I also couldn't tell you in every single state, although there are states where we know we'll try to do a deeper dive into and see if we can track some of that. But it is widespread in that it exists in every single state across the country. And it's just sort of now become part of how we do business and how we operate government. And people are not necessarily thinking twice about it. And it is really important in our work. It also exists in the juvenile justice system, right? We're charging juveniles fines and fees for their contact with the juvenile justice system and their families, and asking them to pay for these things. And in some states that attaches to the juvenile, right? Their license is preemptively suspended. So if you're 13, you're never going to have your license until you pay these fines and fees.
Like a driver's license.
Your driver's license, yeah, is preemptively. So that is also something that happens when you were. So I think that the things sort of to step back are fines and fees happen in every single state. And there are collateral consequences when those fines and fees go unpaid in every single state, which will differ. And then there's also extremely harmful debt collection practices, which is sort of also part of the collateral consequences, because those consequences in the fines and fees space are directly tied to trying to get people to pay, or so they see them as tools to get people to pay. And so those collateral consequences and debt, like very, very predatory debt collection practices also are in every single state in this country.
Okay. I think that's something I probably want to kind of return to in a second. But first, I want to just kind of take the counter perspective here, right? So what if I'm somebody who comes along and says, I hear you, these fines and fees, maybe they're too high, but is there any kind of evidence that suggests that you've seen that suggests like, oh, well, if we have higher fines and fees, we have fewer traffic violations, or we have, lower, there's sort of a deterrence effect here, or there's some sort of, reason to have these in place at the level that they're at, beyond sort of purely trying to raise revenue in a kind of skeezy way?
If it's out there, we haven't found it. There is absolutely no evidence out there that these fines and fees are increasing public safety, deterring certain types of behavior, serving any real meaningful function, aside from being a source of revenue across the country. And so the fee, and once again, looking at these things separately, there is absolutely no evidence that fees do anything, right, except generate revenue. I mean, that's their purpose by definition, is to be a source of revenue for the government. Fines, there's been very little sort of studied in the way of what actually could make a fine impactful, right? And so there's potential, at least in the adult space, to consider that sort of low level fines could play a role in an alternative to incarceration for certain types of things, right? So we're thinking, okay, you do something, you're going to get a $20 fine. You're going to get it every single time you do it, a $20 fine. And, that repetitiveness, consistency, potentially there is, we have to study it. We have to see if that's really even true. What we do know is that the dollar amount of that fine is definitely not part of the equation. So there's nothing that tells us that, hey, if you hit someone with a $500 fine versus a $5 fine, that $500 fine has any more value to the behavior change or the deterrence or anything that might potentially be a reason to have these in place than the $5 fine itself. And so the number itself, which is a large part of the problem on the fine side, is
right.
They're not connected. There's nothing to say that. And I think a real live, like modern day example of this was fines and masks, right? Like we started when we wanted people to wear masks and we were pushing that. You started seeing that pop up everywhere. There's a $500, $250. Now it's $500. Now it's $1,000. Now it's whatever, right? And it wasn't actually changing anyone who wasn't wearing a mask behavior that, all of a sudden, that the governor is saying is $1,000 fine, because the reasons that a person is or isn't wearing a mask is not going to be correlated with the fine you're going to impose upon them, right? And then you have to really get at the behavior. What is it that you're trying to change? What is it that you're trying to get someone to do? And what is it is keeping them from doing that thing? And then you need to come up with real policy solutions in that space. And the same would be true for really anything else, right? So if you're talking about, once again, let's go back to traffic, because it's the most common way these fines show up. We're every day issuing probably millions of traffic tickets across the country, right? And we have automated enforcement, which is a tool that now, instead of the officers and human beings who can issue 50,000 tickets in a year, call it, right? Whatever the number is, the camera can issue over 500,000 tickets, right? And so the rate at which tickets are being issued for these infractions has grown exponentially in places that have replaced, or not even replaced, or really added automated enforcement to the tools of traffic enforcement. And at the same time that this has been going on for, call it, over the last 15 years, 20 years, where you're seeing, more and more cameras, traffic incidents and fatalities have been going up across the country as well, right? And so these have been some of the highest years in dangerous driving across the country. And I live in DC. It's the worst it's ever been, as far as I know, in DC in the last 2 years. And DC has never had more automated enforcement than it does right now in this moment. Yeah. And so what this is telling me is that rather than putting the time and intention into design and infrastructure and the types of things that really actually do influence a person's driving behavior, we think we will enforce our way out of bad drivers. But that's a very individual way of looking at something that is about a system, right? So if everyone is going 50 miles per hour on a street where you want them to drive 20, what that tells me is the street is the problem and maybe not the driver, right? It's like, why is
there's some design flaw here.
Right? There's some design flaw here. If everyone's getting tickets on the street and you want everyone to go 20 and everyone's going 45, there's a design issue there. And so, like all of our systems, but I think that's probably the most illustrative way to sort of show that is we're not looking at what is causing all of these things to happen, but you think you will just enforce your way out of it in ways that are really nonsensical. I mean, we have fines and fees for homeless people. People are being cited financially for, sleeping here, sleeping on a park bench, living, whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. When is that really going to make a person who has homeless not sleep on the park bench? Is that you've given them a fine? or something else really like at issue here that we need to be dealing with, and that a fine is never going to get you the solution that you might be looking for in that particular situation.
Yeah, I think, okay, well, that's a good sort of segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you about. I think it was you, or at least some people who I've seen sort of talk about this fines and fees issue a little bit here and there. Again, it's not super top of mind, I think, for most kind of public policy sort of people, at least not yet. But I've seen the phrase "the criminalization of poverty" pop up. And that seems to be what you're hitting at with sort of the homelessness issue here. And I think similar to the traffic issue, red light cameras, all that kind of stuff. I know streets where there's tons of traffic accidents all the time. And there's a problem with like the way that the exit is designed, or, there's an issue going on. And I'm sure that if they put, police or traffic cameras there'd be a lot of fines there too. But in the absence of those things, you're seeing, traffic problems. And so I agree with you. I don't think that there is, a way to sort of enforce your way into some of these better situations. And, getting back to the raising revenue point, it doesn't seem like that's really the concern here. That's sort of kind of a surface veneer that they kind of put on there. But anyway, I'm getting a little far afield. I want to ask you about that phrase, the criminalization of poverty, and you did hit on it with homelessness, but is that what you mean by that? It's just sort of, at a certain point, it becomes, criminal to be poor, and that's sort of enforced through these fines and fees. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's sort of absolutely what we mean. We call this work the criminalization of poverty. And I think the best way to examine that is to think about it is, do you suffer consequences differently if you are poor versus if you have money, right? And so, going back to the traffic, if I get a $200 ticket, I'm frustrated, I'm annoyed, I'm like, maybe I deserve it, maybe I don't, maybe I think it's a speed trap, like maybe all of these things, right? But yeah. I am going to spend probably the least amount of time I have to, at least where I sit now. My 20-year-old self really would be like scraping to figure out how I'm going to pay these tickets. But, right. This version of me will be frustrated, we'll pay it, we'll move on. And that is solely based on where I sit now and how I'm economically more secure where I am right now. To make that decision and know it is not coming at the cost of my children eating. It is not coming at the cost of my electricity bill being paid this month. It's not coming at the cost of any, medicine or anything that might be vital to my everyday needs or basic necessities. I am not making that decision. I am just paying it and I am moving on, and at best, if I am strict with my budget, well, maybe we're not going out to dinner this month, right? Like maybe there's some discretionary thing that I'm skipping over this month to keep everything in balance. But for someone where $150 is life altering, right? That is the difference between them paying for their electricity bill that they already weren't sure how they were going to pay this month, and their medicine for their children and all of these things, then they are suffering different consequences at the end of the day than I do, because the things they're choosing between are different than what I'm choosing between. So the punishment itself is harsher on that person than it is on me. And if you think of someone like, Bill Gates, someone super rich, it's of no consequence to them that they got a $200 ticket, right? I don't know that makes them drive any faster or slower or park better or whatever that it is in the moment. That
it wouldn't if I were Bill Gates.
Right. I'm not actually being like, well, I just saved myself 3 minutes of time, which might be more valuable to me, right?
It might be.
Right. Like I make, $100,000 a minute. I don't know what the equation is for him, but there might be like a financial analysis there where, okay, that feels worth it to me, right? And so the way we think about that is so different. The other part of talking about criminalizing poverty is the consequences, the things we sort of haven't really got to. So we've talked about how people might make their decision to pay or not be able to pay. But then the next phase is what happens when you don't. And so we've talked about how you have the penalties, the surcharges, the interest, the doubling, all the things that financially begin to accrue on the person who already wasn't in a financial position to handle the underlying fines and fees. But then there's other things. So then you're talking about traffic. your driver's license will be suspended in over 30 states now. And in one way or the other, in most states, when we started this work, it was every state but like 5, where your license was suspended for not paying those fines and fees. Even if, before I got into this work, if I thought about a driver's license suspension, I'm thinking about someone who's unsafe on the road, right? Like you are a danger to yourself and others. And so now you have your license suspended. But millions of people have their license suspended because they did get that. Your tail light is out and you didn't fix it. Your registration is expired. Your stickers aren't in compliance. You change lanes without putting your signal on, things that people do, we know in practice all the time. They're having their driver's license suspended. And the minute you drive in any state with a suspended driver's license, you're committing a criminal offense. So when you get pulled over, it's a minimum of misdemeanor in every state. And so you can be arrested. Then you'll accrue more fines and fees. You will go to jail. And then you go through the process of how long you're held in jail while all of this is happening, and you're sort of released. You probably lose your job. So when we're talking about all of that, there's a series of consequences that then start to unfold for this person who did the same exact thing another person did, but that person could pay themselves out of the situation, and this person could not. And so they're going to continue to suffer more consequences. Yeah. And that happens in all the spaces of sort of the criminal legal system. But the traffic one is the one I like to focus on because it's probably the most relatable to a lot of people, is that, most people have made some type of sort of traffic offense in their life. Yeah.
I mean, and it's really sad, just thinking about that, because that's the kind of thing that I can really see causing sort of a downward spiral. Like you get a traffic ticket, I'm sort of in the same boat as you. I'm just gonna pay it, within reason. I'm just gonna pay it so that I just don't have to think about it anymore. But if you are someone that's struggling to come up with that or something, you miss that payment for one reason or another, $150 is quite a bit different than that like $400 fine. And then if you get your license suspended on top of that, like, well, maybe you can't get to work anymore, like maybe, or at least getting to work becomes like a major challenge in a way that maybe it hadn't before. And, then you start to think about sort of the trade-offs of like, well, I need to get to work on time and maybe drop off the kid or, whatever, some other thing. And you're weighing that against, like, well, my license is technically suspended, but in order to get it unsuspended, I have to pay the fine. In order to pay the fine, I need to go to work. And it's just like, this is a really terrible situation. Cause I don't know, maybe there could easily be a situation where I'm rolling those dice too, Absolutely. Where I'm just like, I need to get to work, or something like that. And
absolutely. I think we all sit in our positions and think, we don't know what we would do if we were in these other positions, right? But there are no good options there for a person at that point, right? All their choices at that point are extremely difficult. They're extremely complicated. And it is too easy to just say, well, if they just did X, Y, and Z, like they wouldn't be here, or, they should just pay their fines, when we know that people do not have, $400 in savings. We know that people don't have that sort of rainy day. They cannot withstand like one unexpected thing happening to them in a month, right? And so, and most people, even ones that are making higher salaries, are living paycheck to paycheck in this country. And so, we are not, as most people in this country are not economically stable in the way we'd like to think. And so these types of unsolicited sort of events that happen in their lives every day can alter the course of, so many things, right? And we see that people have had their licenses suspended for 10, 15, 20 years because they cannot pay the underlying debts that they have. And then once that happens, it's really difficult to get a job, nevertheless keep the job. And like you said, every time you're getting behind, you can't get your car insured. Like there's so many things that happen. So you might have a car, but now it's not insured. And now that, there's all the things that sort of happen that really don't drive good public policy overall. And then you asked a question earlier about public safety. Not only is it not linked, there are studies that show that the more you rely, that a jurisdiction has a higher reliance on fines and fees, the higher their rates of unsolved homicides are. There are sort of public safety numbers that I think we could really measure against public safety goals. They start to diminish. And that's because we're using our law enforcement to be debt collectors, to go out here and do the citation. And when they don't pay, arrest them and spend their time processing people whose only crime is that they didn't pay, instead of letting police officers do what it is that we believe the true value is of law enforcement, and that is keeping communities safe, right? And focusing on how that we do that. And all of these things tie across the thread of, where is this happening? Where are we using police officers like this? How is this showing up? And how that erodes at the trust in those communities with law enforcement. So all of these big things that we're always talking about, these are the little things that make up the big problem, right? These are the things that are showing up because police are not legitimate in the eyes of the communities when they are seen as sort of shakedown artists for them, right? That you're coming and you're citing me for 5 and 6 things that I'm never going to be able to pay. You think about what that does in a community and what that does to the relationship between the police and the communities that they're looking to serve. And that's what happened in Ferguson. You know, that is what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, where they asked their police officers to be doing this for the direct purpose of generating revenue for the government. And when they didn't, issue warrants and arrest people until they pay. And then we wondered, well, how did we get here? Right? How did this happen?
Yeah, and I'm sure the police don't appreciate being put in that position either. You know, I'm sure, you know, if I were a police officer, I would think, you know, why am I wasting my time, you know, chasing down some fine or something when there are probably other things that I should be focusing on, or, you know, other places I could be, other things. There's an opportunity cost there.
Absolutely.
And I just find it particularly grating that the licenses are being suspended, like you said, not for any reason of why they might be unsafe to other drivers, but because it's just the suspension of license is unconnected to their performance as a driver, and it's purely connected to this other, you know, thing. And it's just, I don't understand how that link happened. Like, why had that become a lever, you know, here in terms of, like, you know, collecting debt? Why does that have anything to do with your driver's license? I guess that's just, maybe the connection is traffic violations, or maybe it happens to be the incident, but I find that particularly grating.
And I think if you ask, people have a misbelief that it works, because a lot of times those who are making decisions are like, it would work on me. It would work on me for you to threaten, if I wasn't going to pay, for you to take away my license and, you know, sort of cause me to be inconvenienced. I will, you know, it would make me pay. But that's because you have the money, right? So you're assuming it could very well work on a person who has the money, is like, you know, fingers up to government, and I'm not going to pay. And now the government is going to say, well, you can't have a driver's license. But the number of people that fit into that box who are getting, like, you know, tickets from the government, then just intentionally not paying them, even though they have the money, like, I haven't met that person yet.
Yeah.
You know, I met the person that has made the mistake and not known, or like not appreciated that they got the ticket or forgot. But I have personally, and all the people that I've met who have had their licenses suspended for debt-based drivers, like, none of them said, well, I had the money and I didn't want to pay. And so I was like, you know, let's roll the dice and see what happens. It was not.
I would suspect that's zero. And
Right.
Even, you know, to your point, it has to be the kind of people that would actually affect. You know, they have to be well off enough to pay the ticket, but they can't be the Bill Gates. They can't be so wealthy that it just becomes something they don't care about at all. So there's kind of this band,
Right.
you know, of people that it may affect them. But overall, this just seems like a really inefficient way to do things, obviously.
And you don't collect the money. You don't collect the money. We should just stress that. You are not going to collect money from people who don't have it, right? And so
right, especially if they don't have jobs anymore.
And they don't have jobs anymore. You definitely aren't going to have it. So it's like all those things, it's so counterproductive. It does not even get you, if that's your motivation, it doesn't achieve your goal. So, I mean, that's reason enough to stop. It doesn't even do what you hope it does. So, if it did, we wouldn't have, over 10 million, 11 million driver's licenses suspended across the country, some for decades, because they can't pay.
That's a crazy number.
Yeah. And that's an underestimate. That is based on what we could collect some data on, which is, not nearly what the number is. And if you think about things like the drunk driving or something, you can get your license suspended for 3 months for a DUI in some places, and your first DUI in some places for 3 months, and get your driver's license back. You will have your driver's license suspended indefinitely for rolling through that stop sign until you pay the ticket.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
So things go together.
Well, I want to shift gears a little bit. I think we've established pretty well that this is kind of an insane system that doesn't really work particularly well for its stated or unstated goals. So in your opinion, what are some alternative enforcement mechanisms? Presumably we don't really want people, running red lights or rolling through stop signs or, what have you, right? There's got to be some kind of consequence or structure around some of those things. But what we have now clearly isn't working. So what would work?
Every situation, I think, is going to require sort of a different way to look at it, right? So if you think about traffic, once again, the issue, I can't prove this quite yet, but my guess is that 85% of traffic, maybe 90% of what's going on in traffic is tied to road design. And so you can't just lay in enforcement over bad choices, right? Because that's just like, both these things are just not going to get you anything. You're going to have a ton of enforcement. The problem is never going to change or be fixed. And injuries and fatalities and all the things that we're trying to avoid will continue to happen, right? Because if it's solely about design or largely about design, then that's where we need to start. And so what I want to see is a place where you've said, okay, this is a place where we're seeing people going 40 miles per hour. We want them to be driving 20 miles per hour. It's really dangerous. And there are some really good public policy goals about why a person should drive 20 miles per hour versus, 40 in terms of what the outcomes could be if they hit somebody. And so I can get behind all of that. But what I can't get behind is if your road is designed to go 60, but you're asking people with a sign to go 20, it's not going to click for them. It's not going to click right away. And enforcement in all of this is after the fact. It's after they've already done the thing that you didn't want them to do. And what we're really wanting people to do is slow down or drive differently. And so calming measures, speed bumps, road narrowing, like there's so many design features that go in to changing how a person drives that if you don't have any of that going on, then all we're talking about is enforcement then. All we're talking about is the enforcement. So my answer to this would be, you have to start in the other place. You have to start fixing the design issues and then start seeing what happens to the drivers. Are you dealing with like 80% of the problem right there by just fixing the design? And now we're talking about a much smaller group of people where we need to figure out, is it a few more layers of design? Is it the first time a warning? Because one of the things that we've seen with automated enforcement is that most people are one-time offenders. So once they've done the thing and they know, and now what I'm not entirely sure about, are they changing their behavior for the camera or are they changing their behavior for the driving? And I think what we want is the drivers to behavior to change and not to change for a camera. And so, that's an unanswered question in my book, is that people are one-time offenders, which we do know. So that tells me if 80 to 90% of your tickets are one-time issued, does it have to be a monetary sanction, or is it FYI enough? hey, you ran here, it's supposed to be 20, and then now you're dealing with a smaller population. So I think there's a variety of ways like you can think about that. And when you think about non-traffic, because we haven't really talked about that as much, there's this whole world of misdemeanors. Most of the criminal legal system, over 85% of it is misdemeanors, right? We're not talking about felonies and some of the most egregious sort of crimes where the solutions and the problems and everything are much more difficult and much more complicated to really examine. 85% of what we're talking about is misdemeanors, low-level offenses, often which many don't have a real public safety sort of component to it, right? And so here, what we really need to be doing is examining our laws, like what can be completely legalized. Like, I don't know why it's on the books. I don't know how it got here. Like we were just talking about in Nevada, how feeding the pigeons and sleeping on a park bench are criminal in the state of Nevada, and they're actually policed and enforced, right? And so one thing is like, we all need to be looking at our criminal code and figure out what just doesn't even need to be here. Like, I don't know how it got here. It doesn't matter. Take it off the books together. What should move from criminal to civil? So that is the traffic conversation. Most places traffic is civil. And so that doesn't necessarily deal with the underlying fines and fees. And so you still need to come up with solutions in the fine space, because the fees are revenue generating, but it shouldn't be criminal, right? Every time you do something like criminal shouldn't be where. So what should kind of stay on the books, because it does have a maybe meaningful public policy goal, but be civil and not criminal. And then what needs to stay as true criminal behavior, right? That we need to be examining with the lens of changing, deterring, and altering. And what are the ways that we sort of put in mechanisms in place for those things? So like there's buckets, and all of these things require different solutions, and they're going to require us to also be comfortable with some trial and error, that we're going to try some new things. We're going to look at some new solutions. We're going to decriminalize. We're going to legalize. In the civil space, the biggest thing I think in the adult space is that once we get rid of fees, because our belief is that fees need to be fully eliminated. If you think that government needs to be funded and operate a certain way, everyone should pay for it. Everyone should be a part of that. Those operations benefit the entire community, and they should be paid for the entire community. And your mechanism for that? Taxes. Like, so look at how you're spending your money, look at how you're raising your money, make the tough calls, have the conversations, have buy-in.
Make your case to the public too.
Make your case to the public. The public will tell you, right, what they think, and justify, in some places, fines and fees directly go to paying the salaries of judges. And that seems like a misalignment of incentives if I've ever heard one. In Louisiana, it absolutely works that way. In places, it goes directly to the police department to pay the salaries, the bonuses, the retirements. So there's a lot of misaligned things here of who we're asking to pay and where they're going and where that money is going, right? And so we have to deal with all that. And then let's talk about, if you've done that, right, and all you have now is the fine, what is a fair and equitable fine? To us, the answer to that question is both based on the offense, right? So what did they do, and the person, and what would be punishment for them, right? Is it enough for us to say that a $10 punishment or a $15 punishment may feel like it's like that Bill Gates thing, right? Maybe that's my Bill Gates moment, right? That's my $10. It's like, that's when I get to feel like a millionaire, right? But for someone else, $10 may be it. The fact that they went through this process, that they had a punishment, that they could actually accomplish that accountability by paying, and then they move on, is in and of itself something to think about, right? Versus if a person can never complete the cycle, like you tell them that they're punished, you told them that they have to do this, and they can actually never attain that goal, what's the real lesson in that, right? What's the real punishment in that? Like, it doesn't sort of jive with psychology, like that all those things will work together. So there's a lot of things to be explored. I still feel like we're getting there slowly in some places, but we're still very much stuck on being a culture that is very enforcement heavy and very much, if we punish people severely and enough, we'll create this like utopia society that we're looking for. And I just don't think that that's proven to be true, because that's something we've done very well. Has been very, very punitive and incarcerated a lot of people. And I don't think it's actually gotten us any of the things that we've been looking for as a society.
Yeah, clearly we're falling short in a lot of key ways. I want to back up and kind of highlight one thing you said recently, and then I'll probably push back a little bit on something you said a little bit later. So the first thing I really want to highlight is when I asked you about alternatives to enforcement, specifically in the traffic space, I thought it was really helpful the way that you sort of framed it to think about, well, I was sort of primed for thinking like, what is an alternative enforcement mechanism that will actually accomplish our goal? And I thought it was helpful the way that you sort of pulled back from that and said, well, why are we enforcing things anyway? We want drivers to be safe. We want there to be less traffic accidents. So if we change sort of the road design, maybe we won't need that enforcement. And I think that's a really helpful way of looking at those problems, right? So it's not maybe just finding better ways for enforcement. Maybe it's finding ways that we wouldn't need that enforcement to begin with. And I think that's super helpful and super key. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then the other thing that I'm a little bit worried about, it would be, it might improve sort of the fines and fees system that we have now, which is, I think, as we've talked about, pretty terrible. But I do anticipate sort of maybe a new bucket of problems if we were to give a lot wider discretion to, say, police officers or the justice system to say, instead of having, one uniform fine or fee for this violation, this misdemeanor, we're going to treat everyone sort of individually differently. We're going to take into account these circumstances, maybe their record, maybe, whatever. And I guess to some extent we do that now, but really that's more for more serious things. I think if you push that down, are you worried about sort of creating a system where it feels like punishments and fines and fees are just sort of being delivered on an ad hoc basis, where it just, first of all, that could potentially open up for more abuse, right? That could be, turned in a really negative way. But even apart from that, it might just seem like, oh, we're living in a society where, like, if I do something wrong, I don't know what the consequence of that's going to be. I don't have a good handle on that because it's so different sort of person to person. So can you address that concern, or do you think that's overblown, or how should we think about that?
Yeah, I think that, so those solutions would be created within a sort of a framework. What the guardrails are, right? And so so this sort of income-based fine model or sliding scale model, or it's got different names. It's done in Europe in a different way. It's called day fines in Europe. So I don't know if you've ever seen like the headlines, like, Swedish billionaire gets $2 million traffic ticket. And so there's no cap.
Okay. Interesting.
Oh, you should Google it. So you see that that's a real thing in Europe, is that very, very wealthy people who commit traffic offenses have gotten $1 million tickets for speeding. And that's because they don't have I'm not fully, I don't know all the ins and outs of that system, but there's not caps in that way, right? So you make $1 billion, you legit could get $1 million ticket there. That form would not be adopted, I don't think, in the United States. I don't think anyone's we're not going to go for that here, where even though there's very few billionaires, we still want to make sure that they don't get these $1 million tickets, right? Because I think the American dream is that we can all be billionaires, right? And so we often make policy based on the fact that one day it could be us, right? And so the flip side of that, though, is you can do it with caps, right? And so even if you take a system now where, let's say that the fine for sleeping on the park bench, let's call it, which probably are only homeless people, I imagine, that are oftentimes getting cited for that. But let's just pretend that part's not the case. If a sleeping on the park bench is $100 ticket, then you could design a system where $100 will be the max no matter who does it, right? So like that higher echelon is the worst punishment you could ever get for sleeping on the park bench. What we're really talking about, I think, in our space is what are we doing for the least among us, right? What are we doing for people who are living low to no income, poverty, right above poverty, below poverty, where they shouldn't pay the $100, right? And I think you could design a system that has those guardrails so that you do know what the worst case could ever be in all of these places. But what we're really trying to get at is everyone doesn't have to get the worst case. Everyone doesn't. It's equally inequitable and unfair for the homeless person and the well-off person that just like kind of got drunk and fell asleep on the park bench, but he's really, really well off to get both $100 tickets, right? Because it just means something different to someone who is homeless to get $100 ticket because they will never be able to pay it and they would have warrants out for their arrest every time they have an encounter, right? And so that is more the model where I'm thinking of is there are caps and there are guardrails, right? So you don't get off with, well, now we're just pulling all the rich people in town over because we can give them all $10,000 tickets, you know, and
follow them like a hawk just in case they roll a stop sign.
Right. Like, I knew it. The Mercedes has rolled through and now I'm going to like get them. But so we're also not talking about that, at least not in this country. I don't think where we're going to have, an endless amount of money that you could charge a person for these types of things either. And there is a way, I think, to come up with pilots where we see what does that really look like and what could we test out and what could we see and what work. And there are already places that are implementing low income models for various things on the local level, right? So it's people understand this now that it is not just to charge everyone the same thing because everyone isn't the same. Now you can put you can cap that, but it's really about what happens at the low end that I think we're concerned with.
I tend to agree with that. I think I have kind of a slightly different view on it. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we shouldn't be levying the fines in the same way. In some sense, though, I think the reason that I don't like that is because I think, for some people, different things are going to be effective. And at some point, these gratuitous fines or specifically, taking away driver's licenses, like you're really stopping people from being able to flourish. You're really being able to, you're stopping people from being able to better themselves. And I think that's really, to me, the core reason that we need to sort of change things around. I think in some sense, I almost think that it is kind of the epitome of fairness to say, look, you're rich or poor, no matter who you are in society, this thing that's illegal is illegal, and you are going to get this particular fine for it, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter your background. Like, to me, that there is something that is sort of deeply fair about that just the law, justice is blind. It just doesn't take these things into account. And there's a downside to that, right? I do think that, maybe grounding some of these reforms less in kind of a fairness framework and more of a flourishing framework, saying like, is this accomplishing our goal for public safety? First of all, is this effective? That really should be the first thing. What are the design things that we can look at, in the case of the road, how can we fix this problem so we don't need to enforce? And then secondly, if we are going to enforce these different fines, how do we balance fairness with making sure that we're not just getting people in a hole that they can never get out of? Like, that is not conducive to human flourishing. You're actively, you're hurting people beyond what the immediate consequence of, this particular fine or fee is. So I thought I would kind of put that out there. You can feel free to kind of respond to that or talk about that a little bit more if you want. But I did want to, before we run too much out of time, I did want to get a little bit on where you see these improvements, sort of where you've seen some progress here, and what you like about that, and how that's sort of shaping up. So I'll kind of turn it back over to you here to talk about however you want to take that.
Yeah. Well, so I think on your first point, I would love to be in an ideal where, justice is blind and the way that these things work. It's just the problem with it for me is that enforcement is primarily happening in certain communities, right? So from jump, we are not getting the same kind of enforcement in upper middle class, affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods across this country. That's not where police are hanging out. That's not where they're looking for people. That's not where you can find plenty of crime in all of those neighborhoods too. There's just a different kind of crime and they're happening in different ways, right? And where enforcement is happening is predominantly in low income neighborhoods, oftentimes in this country, Indigenous, Black and Brown communities. And so just in the way that we do it by nature, not even nature, by design, where we're policing, where we're enforcing, it's already not blind and it's already unfair. So I think similar to the traffic, if we step back and we re-examine how we're doing things to begin with, you might be surprised of how much of the problem we solve just by shifting our lens into prosperity and what's the real reason these things are happening and how do we get to it. So then we can have what I would think would be a true conversation about what is the proper way to design enforcement when it's necessary. And what should that look like? And what should the goals of that be? And how should we move forward from it? We're just so far away from that we do have to address what's happening right now, which is this is happening to poor Black and Brown people predominantly, and poor white people too, right? This is happening to poor people across the country. And then we can maybe shift to a much better conversation that I'd love to be here having with you one day, where we're actually talking about that.
Yeah.
And when we're seeing reforms, I think the way that this space is unfolding right now is there is a lot of work in the collateral consequences space of this work right now, because it's triage, right? We're hurting people. So we're seeing policies and laws changing now since we've launched the Free to Drive campaign. 22 states have stopped or significantly curbed their use of debt-based driver's license suspensions across the country. So we're starting to see people understand that issue.
Yeah, good news.
Wanting to make moves in there. And it's a long way from being done, but that is starting to happen, right? And we're starting to see that. We're also seeing more political awareness that the use of fines and fees has great harm in specific communities, along with people getting data and seeing where they've been enforcing and what does it look like. And all the data is showing this is right on economic and racial lines, right? So they're seeing what is actually happening in their jurisdictions. And policies are being put in place to try to get away from these. So there are places like California that has close to 100 administrative fees in the criminal legal system, and they have abolished 45 or so of them already, right? So they're working their way towards getting out of a user fee system and out of a fee system where we're charging people for their contact. And we're starting to see more and more work in fee elimination. And now we're also starting to see people have conversation about what does an equitable fine model really look like, right? What does it look like to do the conversation we're talking about right now, right? What should we be trying? And I will sort of caveat that with the juvenile fines and fees world, it's abolition. That juvenile systems are not about punishment in that way. They are, the adult system also is about rehabilitation, but the juvenile system is really supposed to be about giving kids the opportunity to be prosperous in the world, they're so young to get these things that they need to prosper. And there's no place for fines and fees in those systems, right? They should all be about what are we putting into these kids, not what are we taking from them, what resources are we taking from them and their families while they're going through all these things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm happy to hear that there are some bright spots of reform happening. So I guess maybe second to last question here. What level are you most actively working on? What level of government is this? It sounds more like this is kind of a state thing, but is it, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, is it mostly a state issue? Is it kind of a county or more city level local issue? Or is there some federal things that are going on here? Maybe there's some combination. Where do you see most of the reform what level is most of the reform most needed?
State and local. So a lot of this work, can be done through changes on the legislative level, on the state level, right? So either changing your all the driver's license laws are on the state level, right? So it's every state's got its own driver's licenses. That's all legislation on the state level. The other part of fines and fees work that is on the state level, but also on the local level, is that the states have the power to put into place controls on what local governments can do in the space of fines and fees. Some places are silent about certain things. Some places are very outlined about certain things, but the power to do comes from the state. But on the local level, so in the absence of anything or where it's unclear, the way that this shows up then or maybe even where it's very clear that they can, is on the local level, in municipal governments in particular, where they don't get funding from the state. All their money is coming from fines and fees because they don't get money from the state. They can't tax for the most part, right? And so they're really limited in what their solutions for revenue are. And so that is where fines and fees are showing up really aggressively. But you can fix that both on the local level by getting folks to move away from that, but also on the state level by saying what local governments are and aren't allowed to do in the space of fines and fees, similar to how you tell a local government what they are and aren't allowed to do in the taxing world either, right? Like they're not allowed to just have their own like certain taxes in certain states in certain ways. So it would be similar to that. And so that's where it shows up. On the federal level, there's a little bit of work, but I think you're right in saying that most of this is showing up in the state and local level. That is where the bulk of our attention goes. That's where you're going to get the most return on your reforms and what you're doing. And the federal level can always be in this space a policy leader, right? Really bringing folks together and understanding why this is bad policy. But also a lot of these fees originally generated when the federal government moved out of funding state and local governments in a certain way in their criminal legal system. And so, that's a larger question of whether that's their role or what they should do, but that's when this started, right? And so they were trying to backfill when the federal government stopped. And, the real examination of like, is that the role of the federal government? And if they're not going to play it, if it's not their role, then how are state and local governments really going to support their criminal justice needs on the state and local level in a way that isn't creating more harm to the communities that they really should be looking to serve? Yeah.
So the way they're doing it right now is broken and is clearly not working.
Okay. Absolutely. And it's not sustainable. And it's just, it's just all around bad. So we have nothing but upside from here if we try to actually, figure this out.
Okay. Well, I want to close with sort of this final question here, which is, for people who are listening to this or watching this, maybe they're probably working in or around probably state level government and government issues. What is maybe the one key thing, the one key insight about fines and fees that you'd want them to know if you could basically beam it into like every state lawmaker's brain? What is the one thing that you would want to leave them with that they probably don't know already about this issue?
I think that it just doesn't accomplish anything you think it accomplishes, right? It serves no purpose in what your true public policy goals are. So if you can really believe that and appreciate that, then all you're going to want to do is figure out different solutions, right? So I think to really impart upon local lawmakers that as much as your gut, it might feel like, hey, if we just do this, if we just assess these fines and fees, we'll get what we're looking for. It just isn't the case. And if you can accept that, we could actually start figuring out the right solutions for the things that we're trying to achieve.
All right. I think that's a good place to end it. Priya, thank you for coming on and talking about this today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was great.